right, well, there we go. As Emily alluded to earlier in her kind of overview of SZ4D and the sort of structure, this is going to be the first of three talks that just outline, and the way I think of it is sort of maybe priming the pump for the rest of this meeting. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail about the science questions, but that's, of course, what we hope will be part of the discussion and kind of embedded in the discussions throughout the next couple of days in the breakouts. So this is, I'm up here kind of representing the faulting and earthquake cycles working group. Following me, you'll actually hear from Kristen on landscapes and seascapes, and then you'll hear from Pete on the MDE, the magmatic drivers eruption working groups, kind of both the process by which the science questions were developed, and then outlines of what those science questions are and some envisioned activities, again, really to prime the pump. So the faulting and earthquake cycles group was, again, one of the sort of three sets of sort of science working groups charged with coming up with a series of questions that, as you'll see shortly, probably are not unfamiliar to you if you've been circulating in these communities in the margins, geoprisms, ocean drilling program, EarthScope communities, but really focused on a lot of the big sort of grand challenges, what we don't know about faulting earthquakes and subduction zones in this case. The working group that sort of over the last 2.5+ years. So this process, although it kind of kicked off in 2016 at the Subduction Zone Observatories meeting in Boise that many folks have already mentioned, the real effort in sort of sitting down and workshopping out what the big science questions were for each of these three working groups started in Albuquerque in 2020. So in January of 2020, so now coming up on almost 3 years, this is the group for the faulting earthquakes team that developed a lot of those questions and thought through the where, the what, the how. And then just to kind of give you a sense that a little more than 2/3 of that group has now rotated out. And this is the new committee going forward, or the new working group going forward, that will be thinking again about those science questions and how we begin to address them as a community. All right, and I sort of inserted this slide. It's not in the report, but it's one I like because it kind of shows in a sense a bit of an evolution from really simplistic ways of thinking about, and I say simplistic, this was only 24 years ago when this paper came out. It's a Chris Schultz paper in 1998, but simplistic ways of thinking about seismogenesis and earthquakes in subduction zones where you have like a stable creeping zone and then a zone that's seismogenic and then it goes back to creeping. And of course, with more observations, both in the laboratory and in the field, that view has evolved into something far more complex. And so this is from the Ocean Drilling Program Science Plan, kind of, again, showing a little bit more complexity with these tremor and small earthquakes and other kinds of behaviors. And now, the modern view, and I'm afraid the pointer is sort of running out of steam here, but the modern view is, of course, one of a highly complex subduction zone earthquake system in which the plate interface itself, along with subsidiary faults, may participate. There may be different behaviors over time and space that evolve over geologic time or even over the earthquake cycle in terms of where and when earthquakes nucleate, how big they are, and the style of slip. And so that's really motivated kind of a next generation of questions in terms of trying to understand the way these systems behave. And in a lot of ways, that emerging complexity and that's motivated by new observations is what's motivated this set of questions, the core questions for FEC, the Faulting Earthquakes Cycles group. And so I'll just lay these out. These are in the report, but just in case people don't remember them, didn't commit them to memory, or maybe, God forbid, didn't have a chance to read the report yet. Everybody's read it, I'm sure. So this is kind of the cliff notes, right? So the first question is focused on the interaction of fault systems. So this is how do subduction zone fault systems interact in space and time? How do these fault systems and associated deformation regulate subduction zone evolution and structure? So it's linking the earthquake timescale with the longer timescale. This is also one of the questions that most obviously connects between the landscapes and seascapes groups with the earthquake cycles group. So you'll hear a little bit more about that from Kristen next. The second question is about controls on the speed and mode of slip-on faults in space and time. And so this question is sort of more focused on the so-called spectrum of slip behaviors and this recognition that we don't just have earthquakes and aseismic creep, but again, there's sort of a whole range of behaviors filling in the space in between. Question 3 is focused on precursory phenomena and whether there are observable precursory slip or foreshocks, whether these are slow slip or coalescing signals of seismicity, both in space and time that occur before large earthquakes. And then what are the mechanisms or causes for those? And then the 4th question is much more squarely focused on tsunami hazard, and sort of what the conditions and processes are that would permit or promote large displacements of the seafloor and the likelihood of generating tsunami. So again, I'm not going to go into these in gory detail, but just kind of lay out with a little bit of a quick vignette here what we mean by each of these in case it's not clear. And so here's an example. This is from Watt and Danny Brothers, and it's just an example from Cascadia, again, sort of showing that interplay between what's going on the plate interface proper and the evolution of the geology and faulting in the upper plate in Cascadia. And so this, again, is just one way in which we might think about this interaction between faults in the subduction system and what they might mean for strain accumulation and release in earthquakes or other modes of slip. This is a figure from Yokota et al. In one of a series of papers where they've used GNSSA offshore Japan to document coupling. And so this is really focused on the question of what controls, or just an example of what controls the speed and mode of slip in space and time. Again, the idea that there may be aseismic creep, there may be large earthquakes and locking in between those large earthquakes. There may also be things like episodic tremor and slip at the down dip edge of the seismogenic zone, or slow earthquakes and tremor at the shallow end, or even within the so-called seismogenic zone. I have no idea why I keep trying to point with this thing. Can you guys see it if I point with it? No, all right. It's a placebo effect. All right, then the 3rd question again is focused on precursory slip and the question of whether there are distinctive foreshocks or perhaps other modes of slip that could be identified or revealed through intensive monitoring offshore or onshore. And then a sort of a deeper question here is, okay, if they do exist, then what causes them? Outstanding. Thank you, Anais. Yep. Beautiful. All right. And then the 4th question again is sort of focused on tsunami generation and the conditions that may allow that to arise. And so there are lots of observations. For example, that like the Tohoku earthquake is one where Eric Dunham and his group have demonstrated that the role of the elastic properties in the outer part of the upper plate are significant. And that's not what's shown in the figure here, but just as an example of the kinds of things that people are thinking about for this problem. That there are certain properties of the rocks or conditions or styles of rupture that may promote large seafloor displacements. Okay, so this is kind of a little bit of a retrospective, but I think to get everybody in the room to kind of, for lack of a better term, up to speed with sort of the process by which we developed these questions and started thinking about it over the last few years. So a big part of this is sort of trying to figure out the what. And what I mean by this is what are the observations and field data that are needed to answer these questions. And I'm just curious, how many people in this room had heard of a traceability matrix before you started with SZ4D? That's what I thought. Me either, but I've grown to love them so much. I've actually adopted it for my personal life as well. It's pretty awesome. Ask me later. But the idea is it's a really nice way of systematically mapping between the things we want to answer, the questions we want to answer, and the kinds of data that we might collect to address those. And I'll show you the outcome of that in a very brief way in just a second. This has led to the plans for these generic or notional experiments that Emily mentioned earlier. And then we also started to tackle the question of where, and you heard about this from Emily as well, right? And so to do this, we needed to think about in a really detailed way what we know about every subduction zone in the world in terms of its earthquake history, earthquake behavior, sediment thickness, the kinds of data that are available, and so on. And then, of course, this development of collaborations internationally and within the US as well. Okay, so this is just one incarnation of a traceability matrix. Questions are the rows, and different kinds of activities or data types are the columns. And it's kind of a heat map This shows you that for particular questions, there are certain things that are really important, and exactly what the headings are is not critical here, right? But the hotspots are clearly data types that are important for all of our questions, and then others that would be nice, but maybe not as important for all the questions. And so this provided a really nice means to objectively evaluate and discuss the importance of different kinds of data or activities for addressing each of the 4 questions. And as I mentioned, right, so some information where you have the red columns, that means that those are observations that are really important for pretty much all of our questions, and others may be important for some questions and not others. And then others may be sort of nice to have, but not essential. And this sort of led to some ideas for the FEC group, at least, for what the notional experiments might look like. And so just to kind of lay out some of the priorities that emerged from this really quickly. One is, and maybe this is obvious to folks in the room, but a need for new amphibious observations of subduction zone behavior. So going from onshore to offshore, particularly monitoring strain, slip behavior, and seismicity. And offshore observations are noted as a particular gap. Of course, this is where a significant portion of the fault zone actually lives, and we have very little information and certainly pretty poor resolution in terms of its activity when we think about strain accumulation and release. Another part of this, of course, is looking deeper in time and thinking about the paleoseismology and geology. And so that's kind of what's shown on the right here as an example of trying to push that understanding of subduction fault behavior back in time. Another priority that emerged from this analysis or the sort of framework is the geology, geophysical imaging, sort of these activities, in a sense, these sort of allied studies that are really important to link any observations of strain accumulation, displacement on faults, earthquake behavior to process, right? So you can observe what the fault is doing, but to understand why it's doing that requires observations that link that to process, whether that's lab experimentation, geological studies that tell us something about the rheology or the role of fluids, modeling that can link the physics to the observations, and then larger scale imaging that can map physical properties and state. And I'm not going to spend a lot of detail here, but let's just say that the notional observational plan just for the FEC component of this is instrumentation forward and instrumentation heavy, both on land and offshore. And it's a fairly ambitious, but certainly scalable in the sense that it would scale with footprint and also desired resolution. But to really be a kind of transformational advance here, one of the things that we envisioned is, at least in some places, really high density of observations and linked observations of seismicity along with geodesy. And of course, that would be paired tightly with observations of geology and sampling for experimentation that would be done in laboratories to understand, again, the sort of mechanistic side of this. And then finally, I don't think I need to, again, Emily kind of discussed this, but the other part of how FEC came up with priority areas and sort of where we landed in Chile, Alaska, and Cascadia, in large part came also out of a similar kind of exercise to the traceability matrix. And this is thinking about the where, meant thinking about what do we know about all the subduction zones around the world, and which would give us the best information, either because of something favorable in their geography, because of their earthquake behavior, because of accessibility, and or because they provide good analogs or comparative locations to other areas of priority. So for example, being able to learn something about what might be happening in Cascadia by studying Chile and vice versa. So kind of complementary field sites. And I think I will leave it there.